my motivation it stems from that interconnection. I feel as a human being, as a member, of the human race and one of the living beings who occupy the surface of this planet, I feel an urgent need for transformation. I sense really deeply that unless we do undergo some collective transformation, there will be catastrophic effects. You know, our only the only possibility we have of living in harmony this on this planet in the future is by transcending our present state of separation and experiencing I think we are fundamentally interconnected. It's just that we've lost experience of it. We've lost sight of it. But the only way for us to survive and flourish is for us to experience our fundamental interconnectedness.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist. I love studying meaningful coincidences. We all have potential paths in our lives, and this is mine, is to try to be able to help increase synchronicity awareness in the global mind for its many uses. And we'll talk about its many uses today, and particularly in regard to connection and time. I'll start off with a little story. I communicate with the spirit of the father of a good friend of mine. I got in contact with him during a breathwork exercise that she was leading, and we contact each other. We have conversations every once in a while. But the funny thing is, for wherever he is, and my parents are around there too. My parents are deceased also. When I call on him, when I say, "Hey, Tim," he's there right away. I mean, there's no time lapse. He's just like there. So there's something about time and the dimension that some of our deceased relatives are living that is not the same as the time we have here, because no space or time seems to inhibit his coming to talk with me. So I start off with a question of how is time different among the disembodied, and what can we learn about time from them? And please subscribe and like what we're doing here, and text me or in the chat of this or other conversations, and I like to respond, see what people come up with. So I will introduce our guest for today. His name is Steve Taylor, and he's the author of 16 books on psychology and spirituality, and is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. He is a past chair of the Transpersonal Psychology Section of the British Psychological Society. His new book, The Adventure, A Practical Guide to Spiritual Awakening. And if you want to read more about that, he has a blog on Psychology Today that has a lot of his ideas about what actually is spiritual awakening, and even a way of measuring it, because there's different forms in which spiritual awakening can take place. His other books include Extraordinary Awakenings, The Clear Light Out of Darkness, Back to Sanity, The Calm Center, The Leap, and Spiritual Science. His books have been published in 20 languages, and his articles and essays have been published in many different places. He's got a blog for Scientific American, which just shows he's bridging the weird with the ordinary, and that's what's so much fun about him. He's on that edge, going on both sides. He's got a blog for Psychology Today, as do I. So welcome to the show, Steve Taylor.
Hi there, Bernard. Great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you, and nice to have another Brit. And I like it when Brits call me Bernard, because that's what they do. That's what
Yeah.
they do there.
Yeah. I heard you refer to yourself as Bernard, so I use that pronunciation.
It's an American audience. What can I do? Yeah. So what can you tell us a little bit about, tell us about an interesting coincidence you had that was a little surprising to you and how we can get to that from time to time.
Well, this happened about 10 years ago, and I one Saturday morning I was listening to the radio, and there was a famous author, a guy called Nick Hornby, who's quite a well-known author here in the UK. And he was saying that whenever he saw somebody reading one of his books, if he was on the tube or in a park or wherever, he would go up to them and say, "Hi, I'm Nick Hornby. I'm the author of that book." And the person would go, "Oh wow, I can't believe it." So the next day I met a friend for coffee and I said to my friend, "Wow, that's really cool. If that ever happened to me, if I ever saw somebody reading one of my books, I'd do the same. I'd go up to them and say, 'Hi, I'm Steve Taylor. I'm the author of that book.'" And obviously that had never happened to me. But just 3 days later, I was in London and I was sitting on the tube train, and the guy next to me was reading his Kindle. And I just glanced over and I thought, that looks familiar. I recognize those words. And it was one of my books. It was my book called Waking from Sleep. I was totally flabbergasted. And I said to the guy, "You're not going to believe this, but I'm the author of that book." And he said, "What?" And we had a nice conversation. But it was so bizarre because when synchronicities like that happen, I get a kind of chill, like a shiver at the up the back of my spine because it was like the universe was telling me something. It was telling me how things are interconnected. We're in control. There's a pattern behind things, and it's I think only on only one other occasion since then have I met somebody reading one of my books in public. So it was a really impossible coincidence for it to happen just after I talked about it to my friend.
It's the timeliness of it.
Yeah.
It's the timeliness of it. And you thought of it and there it happened. I add that your mind had been primed to look for somebody like that.
Not really. I mean, I always, whenever I'm on the train or on the bus and I see somebody reading a book, I always look at what they're reading. I'm always curious. I always look over their shoulder.
And,
So,
and you're looking to see if they're reading your book, maybe.
well,
Oh,
I've given up
sure.
with that really, though. It happens so seldom that it's a
So
forlorn hope.
so that wasn't so much it. So what do you make out of, and since you are very interested in time, what do you make out of this, I'll say, timely event? Told about it, and then you see it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just about to publish a new book about time called Time Expansion Experiences. And it's based on, for the past 5 years or so, I've been doing research into unusual experiences of time, which has resulted in that book. And I think what I have concluded from my research is that, there are some levels of reality where time does not exist, where everything happens simultaneously, where there is no sequence, maybe even not even any causality. There's just a kind of, a oneness where, in some sense, all things are happening simultaneously. And I mean, I think, when these experiences happen, they do seem to collapse time. We seem to tune into a transcendent dimension where linear time does not exist. So that's what I've concluded from my researches and also from experiences like that.
Of course, that's a hard thing for us human beings and living in this three-dimensional reality where time is so linear. We have
Mm.
our watches and when our next TV program is going to be on or when we're going to go someplace. There's this linear thing. But somehow you're saying two profound things, really, that everything's happening around the same time and that
Yeah.
time isn't what we think it is. Tell us what you think this time collapse, this time
Mhm.
variation that you are studying. Tell us about it for just us people living in this reality.
In my book, I first of all discuss what I call time expansion experiences. And a lot of people are familiar with these experiences from accidents. I mean, I had a car crash 10 years ago, which stimulated my interest in this area because our car was spinning around in the middle of the highway after we had been, a lorry had crashed into the back of our car and so it started spinning around on the motorway. And immediately, as soon as the sound of the truck bashed into our car, time went into slow motion. Time seemed to freeze. And I felt as though I had a lot of time to consider what to do in the situation. I had a lot of time to perceive the reality of the situation. And in reality, it was probably 3 or 4 seconds. The whole incident probably happened within 3 or 4 seconds. But in my mind, it was 20 or 30 times longer than that. It was at least a minute. And then those experiences are very common, not just in car crashes, but also during falls and in other situations, for example, under the influence of psychedelic substances, in deep meditation. So that's one aspect of it. But I've also studied what I call time cessation experiences, when time doesn't just expand, but it stops altogether. And that's when these are the experiences when time becomes like space. It becomes panoramic, so that all time is within the present. The future and the past become part of the present. They are laid out before us in an endless panorama.
I've had experiences like that. Pop, it's all happening here, and there are times when I can see past lives, my past experiences of my life,
Mhm.
right around the same time. There comes these times when time isn't what we think it is, slows down, stops. What do you think's going on somewhere in our mind or brain when time seems to slow down like that or even stop?
There are some attempts to explain these experiences in neurological terms, but they're not very satisfactory. People normally try to explain them in terms of higher levels of noradrenaline, putting us into a fight or flight mode. But actually, when these experiences occur, even in accidents and falls, people feel incredibly calm. They're actually in a kind of detached, meditative state rather than a state of anxiety. And also, these experiences occur in extremely relaxed situations, for example, meditation. So that suggests that they're not linked to higher levels of adrenaline or similar explanations. One important thing about them is that they all occur in altered states of consciousness. Even in accidents, when accidents happen, they shift us into an altered state of consciousness straight away. The sudden shock of the accident or the fall or whatever it may be jolts us into an altered state of consciousness. So that leads to the conclusion that time, our normal perception of time, is created by our normal consciousness. It's a construct created by the normal structures and processes of our normal consciousness. So as soon as you change those structures, as soon as you shift into an altered state, then time becomes something completely different. And usually time slows down radically. It's almost as if you enter a portal or a gateway, and suddenly you're in this wide expanse of time, of slowed down time. So it's certainly connected to altered states of consciousness. And I think fundamentally it's about transcending separateness. Our normal sense of time seems to be created by our sense of separateness, our sense of kind of being a separate entity living inside our mental space. As soon as we go beyond that, or as soon as our identity is softened or weakened, then we enter this slowed down, expansive time world.
And what about the reality of this time world? How do you, since we're trying to figure out what reality is, what is it? What does this tell us about where we're living?
It tells us that we're living in a constructed reality, a reality which is filtered through our minds, through our mental structures. It tells us that fundamentally there is really no such thing as linear time. Fundamentally, time is like space. It's everywhere. I mean, and that also, it fits with some of the findings and theories from modern physics too. And it fits with there are many ideas in philosophy which are similar. Like the philosopher Kant, Immanuel Kant, one of his basic ideas was that time is a construct. Time and space are constructs of the mind. That beyond the mind, if you could get outside the mind, you wouldn't find any time. There would just be timelessness.
And finding that, I just even since you study this so much, how does this time and space change influence the way you lead your life?
Well, it helps me to, um, that's an important point that space and time are always interrelated. In these experiences, time expansion experiences or time cessation experiences, there is not only a different sense of time, there's also a different sense of space. And usually that means that a person feels that they're not confined to their own mind or body, they're part of their surroundings, they're connected to other people. Sometimes people perceive themselves outside their bodies, observing from a distance. And often people have a sense of interconnection. They feel that everything is interconnected, nothing is separate, or the seeming separateness of things is illusory. So, in terms of living in my own life, I don't feel so oppressed by time. I think it's quite normal for human beings to feel oppressed by time, because time seems to run away from us. It seems to be an enemy. We're always fighting against time to do what we need to do, to keep our deadlines and appointments. So we always feel that time is limited and it's kind of an enemy. But I don't really feel like that. I feel that there is this expansive time, even if I'm not consciously aware of it now, I know it's there. So it helps me to feel less oppressed by time. And also the knowledge that time is illusory fundamentally, that also helps in that process.
Well, if we didn't have time, we wouldn't be talking right now because you might have just said, "Oh, the time's going to just go by, so maybe I'll be connected with Bernie in a different way." Um, there's a certain physical body necessity to have something to do with time, but maybe we do overdo that for sure.
Hmm.
But still, it has a practical value, I think, just like you got to eat to keep the body together.
That's true. I mean, maybe that's why we do live in a world of time, because it would be impractical for us to live in a timeless world. It would be difficult for us to focus on the present if we were continually aware of the future and the past. Maybe that's why we do have this filter in our minds that makes us live in a world of linear time. But nevertheless, I do think it's possible to sense timelessness and to live in time. It's a question of focus, really. When we need to do what we need to do, then we focus our minds. When we need to keep an appointment at the doctor's or the dentist, we need to focus our minds and return to a world of time. But otherwise, we're free to allow our attention to range more widely and to you know, sense an expansive range of time or even sense timelessness.
Well, you have an ongoing, uh, I'll say, I'll call it a conflict, even though you don't might experience it that way. You've written 16 books. You're a lecturer. Uh,
Hmm.
y- the lecturer requires you to be there when the students are there, yes.
Yeah.
Um, Writing books also requires some kind of organization of your time to be able
Hmm.
to write them. So you have to sit down when you have the time, let's say, to do that. So
Mm.
that I'm trying to see the the real problem, one of the real problems of this life on Earth is the polarities that we live in. We,
That's true. Mm.
and this is a polarity that is fascinating to me. The polarity of I got to be here when Steve shows up, or it's all, and it's also like a sense of oneness of time and space. So
Yeah.
I'm asking, how do you navigate? You just said you navigated by saying not take time to so seriously, but how you
Mm.
still have to navigate the three-dimensional body and other people's use of time in your own life while also being aware and able to
Mm.
go into a more unified space-time.
It's a question of, yeah, it is a question of integration. When I was younger, I found it really difficult to live in the world of time or just the normal world, itself. I was quite kind of disorganized and impractical. I'd often show up late and
Yeah,
but as
that's
I've
what
got older, I've just learned.
I.
I guess it's if you think in terms of the two sides of the brain, if you want to think in terms of that model of the left brain and the right brain, it's a question of like integrating the two sides of the brain. Your right brain can still function well, you can still be spiritual and creative and intuitive, but when when need be, you can still be practical and logical. It is possible to live in both worlds at the same time. People often say that. I mean, I've done a lot of research into spiritual awakening. I've interviewed a lot of people who've undergone spiritual awakenings, and I've investigated a lot of different spiritual practices and spiritual traditions. And people often say, how could you be spiritually awakened and live in the world? It would be impossible. You wouldn't be able to hold down a job. You wouldn't be able to keep appointments. You wouldn't be able to go shopping or drive a car because you'd be living in a state of ecstasy, or you'd be living with a sense of the oneness of everything, and that would make it impossible to be practical. But I don't think that's the case. It is possible to be spiritually awakened and to live a normal life. You know, it's a question of focus. When you become spiritually awakened, you don't lose the ability to focus or concentrate. In fact, in some ways, those abilities can be enhanced. So when need be, you can step away from your sense of oneness or bliss and just, you know, drive the car or pay the bill or cook the meal. And then when it's over, you can expand your attention again. You can reattune to that sense of oneness or bliss. So it's really a question of focus and attention.
I think of it also as a way of living, and that's what I'm most interested in because meaningful coincidences like synchronicity show how we are interconnected with each other. That
Hmm.
time and space become not as prominent just by having an experience of something connecting with you. You think you find somebody sitting next to you who's doing something that you were wondering if you could ever find somebody to do that, and you did, and it suggests something about connectedness and time and space have something to do with the connectedness, which is
Hmm.
an important part of this whole, let me say, necessity that we have in transforming the way we experience the world, that we have to see our connectedness. And I
Hmm.
think you have been very clear about the importance of recognizing our disconnectedness and finding ways of being able to connect. And
Hmm. Hmm.
how do you use connectedness? How do you use time and space to connect with other people?
Once you begin to transcend separation, then you step into a different reality. I think the crisis of the modern world is a crisis of disconnection
Yeah.
or separation. And you can see it in science, in the mindset of scientific materialism. which is fundamentally based on separation, the idea that everything is broken down into units and all these units are distinct and separate. And living beings are just biological machines who live in separation to one another. But as soon as you start to move beyond that, then you do start to uncover patterns. You start to feel more empathically connected to other human beings and other living beings. You feel more empathically connected to the whole earth, the whole cosmos. And I've always thought that synchronicity is a part of that, that once you transcend separation, you enter into this kind of ocean of connectedness. And then you start to discover more connections and to experience more connections. And I remember a guy, did you ever remember a guy called David Fontana? Did you ever read any of his books or encounter him?
Familiar name? No, I have
Yeah,
not.
he passed away maybe 10 years ago, but he wrote a lot of spiritual books and psychology books. But yeah, I remember he once said to me that um, in his life, when he meditates more than 2 hours a day, then synchronicities happen all the time. But if he stops meditating, synchronicities seem to stop happening. And I think that's because meditation takes you into a world of connection. Whereas when you fall into separateness again, maybe when you stop meditating, then you fall into disconnection again and you lose sense, and you lose the kind of harmony that allows you to experience or uncover those kind of connections.
I think I think that's true. One of the we have a lot of problems here on Earth, as we all are feeling as well as knowing. And much of it is related to the sense of disconnectedness that we are experiencing. I
Mm,
need, this is what I need, and this is what I need, and the conflict begins to take place. And what you're talking about with time as well as with space is a key part of being able to help a necessary transformation, I think, in the way human beings experience not
mm,
only each other, but also the natural world of which we are a part. And
mm,
I think what you're talking about has some important value in contributing to, let me call it the army. It's not the right word to use in a way, but to try to that of people who are trying to say we are much more connected with each other than we are currently being taught or even
mm.
experiencing. And
Yeah,
you're doing something about that in your way, with emphasizing the time collapse, the time expansion,
mm,
the the oneness that comes out of some of those experiences. And I wonder how
yeah.
you think about what you're writing about might be of help to humanity.
I hope so. I've always felt that without sounding grandiose, I've always felt that my mission or the kind of motivation of my writing and my speaking is to bring about a shift in consciousness, to try to contribute to a
Yeah,
shift in consciousness,
yeah.
which I think is taking place. But you know, I hope that I'm adding further momentum to that shift. And and my motivation it stems from that interconnection. I feel as a human being, as a member, of the human race and one of the living beings who occupy the surface of this planet. I feel an urgent need for transformation. I sense really deeply that unless we do undergo some collective transformation, there will be catastrophic effects. You know, our only the only possibility we have of living in harmony this on this planet in the future is by transcending our present state of separation and experiencing I think we are fundamentally interconnected. It's just that we've lost experience of it. We've lost sight of it. But the only way for us to survive and flourish is for us to experience our fundamental interconnectedness.
Well, that's my message through the synchronicity, meaningful coincidence pathway. Uh,
Mm.
that's that, and I think I heard you say it might sound grandiose for you to think you're making a contribution to the need that humanity has for recognizing our interconnection. I ask you to, not just for your sake, really, but for the sake of the people listening to you, watching you, is that you're doing what a lot of us have to be doing, is
Mm.
recognizing our mission, that you're not the only one, and
No.
yours isn't that different in scope and necessity from a bunch of other people who are also doing something in their own
Mm.
way.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you, just for I don't know, for our audience sake, and for mine. Let's say that you, like me, and like many others, have a mission. I mean,
Yeah.
there was Mission Impossible and the TV shows about that. There's a that, well, what's your mission going to be here? Well, I'm going to be doing this. It becomes kind of like a
Mm.
spy thriller sometimes. It's like, well, I've got to go take care of this, and it's usually some kind of hero who
Mm.
may be an ordinary person, which is part of the fun of it, who is doing this something that looks grandiose, at least on the TV screen, that only this person can do it. But you have a mission. It's important. You're doing time, and with that, space. And
Mm.
I'm asking you, just in in a kind of a, like a small paragraph or something, is to tell me, what is Steve Taylor's mission in life now?
Well, I feel that I am carrying out my mission, so I want to continue it. It took me a long time. It seemed like a long time. It took me a long time to find my purpose. I only really began to find it. I think it was always there, but I didn't really accept it or understand it. But I began to really attune to my purpose when I was about like 29, 30 years old. And then everything just seemed to align and I felt like I was off, and everything began to fall into place. So I feel like I'm continuing my mission that I've had followed for the last 20 years or so. And, the longer it carries on, the more urgent it feels and the more powerful it feels. I do feel that there is a kind of something flowing through me and I'm expressing it. I'm kind of doing my duty to manifest what's coming through me. And it manifests mainly in my writing. Whenever I sit down to write, it feels like what I'm supposed to do. It feels like the right thing for me to do. I never feel sort of more contented than when I'm writing. And yeah, I feel that's what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to, in my writings, and also, in my talks as well. On one level, I'm helping to bring about a process of spiritual transformation in individuals and also collectively. But one sort of theme that's gone all the way through my work is I've been investigating and trying to understand the process of spiritual awakening. And I've always felt that spiritual awakening is much more common than people normally realize. And it happens all the time outside the context of spiritual traditions. It happens a lot when people undergo turmoil and crisis in their lives. They undergo a shift of identity, and a new spiritually awakened self seems to arise. So that I think that's part of my mission is to sort of demystify spiritual awakening, to make it more accessible, and for people to understand their own spiritual awakenings. And in that way, you know, we're making a contribution to the collective spiritual transformation, the collective spiritual awakening of our species, which I think is taking place, even if it's taking place quite slowly, but I think the process is already underway.
It's uh, it's happening, and maybe accelerating. It's hard to measure. But spiritual awakening is for individuals. And it seems to me what you're talking about with spiritual awakening, as well as recognizing that time isn't what we think it is focused on individuals. Would that be fair
Hmm.
to say?
Yeah, on one level, yeah, certainly overtly it's focused on individuals.
And then you're hoping that by helping individuals recognize time, space, and their own spiritual awakenings, which some people get confused about. And you list, I think, 4 different kinds of ways that people can be spiritually awakened. And then you're helping them recognize that they are being spiritually awakened. So with
Yeah.
both time and spiritual awakening, you're focused on individuals who then can help with the transformation that you see is necessary and looks like it's coming.
Yeah. I wrote a book called The Leap a few years ago, which was subtitled The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. And it was mainly a study of people's individual spiritual awakening. I looked into the different ways in which spiritual awakening can occur, the different characteristics of spiritual awakening. But the book ended with a chapter about a chapter about the collective awakening of the human race. And I listed a number of signs which suggest that this awakening is taking place. And I suggested that our own spiritual awakenings and our own spiritual development contributes to this collective awakening. And I think the impulse that many people feel to follow a path of spiritual awakening or to follow spiritual practices stems from this impulse. Where does this impulse come from? It comes from, a deep-rooted impulse, a deep-rooted collective impulse to move towards awakening. We're all engaged in this collective project, which is moving us towards spiritual awakening. And, and that's why so many of us feel this urgent need for awakening.
So you recognize a a global tendency to be spiritually awakened, of which individuals are creating that
Hmm.
global awakening.
Yeah.
Are there any other outside human beings, let's say forces, facilitating this collective awareness, this collective spiritual awakening?
Mm. That's an interesting question. Possibly. I mean, I do believe in the existence of not just the overt life forms that we can see, but subtle beings who exist in different dimensions, who may influence this dimension. And I do believe in some form of life after death, and I do believe that spirits from the next world or from the post-mortem world can contact and influence what happens in this domain. So it's possible that they are influencing us too. And maybe there's an influence from reincarnation as well. I believe that there is a lot of evidence for reincarnation, and that some people have a spiritual impulse because they've carried it over from a previous life. I mean, I think of myself in those terms because there was nothing in my background that predisposed me towards spirituality or philosophy or psychology or in any interest in these areas, but it seemed to be just inside me from a young age. There was no external influences at all. It was just purely internal. So I think maybe it came from a previous existence.
Yeah, so you're open to that possibility. And
Yeah.
I mean, for me, one of those, I like people say these fun facts. It's a phrase being used now. Is this this father of this friend of mine who can show up? Okay, he's even right here now listening to this because I just
Yeah.
mentioned him. It's like okay, hey Tim, what's happening? Yeah, this ability to um of the discarnate being uh to not bother with time and space. It just shows up when I think
Yeah.
about him. Uh,
Right.
to me, that's kind of a lesson in the direction you're talking about. Because if he's doing it discarnately, there's probably some way to do it carnately with our bodies in this level. So it's a kind of a teaching just by
Yeah.
observation.
You think that's possible for us to do it in these bodies as well?
Is to be able to show up psychologically when
Mm.
somebody asks us. Uh, and
Yeah.
and the and the key question is the asking us. And this is one of the lessons of artificial intelligence. There's so much I, fear of an artificial intelligence floating around out there. They're going to get us. They're going to get us somehow.
Hmm.
I'm looking at the mind of ChatGPT, trying to see how the mind of GPT resembles the mind of human beings, and being able to learn how my mind works uh, off of seeing a kind of mirror, a distorted mirror of my mind, of the mind of humanity. And
Hmm.
one of the things that's so evident, no matter who you are, if you use Chat GPT, is the prompt is so vital. If there's
Hmm.
any one fact anybody needs to know if you're going to be involved with it, is what's the prompt? And there's all kinds of like thousands of pages of this, use this prompt and your life will be better kinds of things. I like a lot of things that's exaggerated, but a prompt is a question. A prompt is a question. So what's key to me is being able to ask the other beings for help, which people do. They have their team,
Hmm.
my team, please come in and give me some help here. So
Hmm.
that is a critical part, asking the question of having other beings be participating in this thing with us.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess it's again it's about transcending separation. I think if you're enclosed in an ego, and you're not open to these kinds of experiences. It's only once your ego is softened, once you become more connected, then you know a lot more stuff can get through. You become open to spiritual experiences. You become open to creativity. You become open to psychic experiences like telepathy, precognition, and also maybe you become open to contact with spirits.
Why not? I mean, there's so many stories of contacts like that.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, if you look into the experiences of mediums, I mean, mediums say
yeah,
that there are certain times when nothing comes through. Maybe they're
yeah,
they're
no.
maybe their minds are just not open, but when they're in a kind of open state, when their ego boundaries are soft and fluid and permeable, then that's when, spirits start to speak to them.
What do you mean by ego boundaries being soft and fluid?
Well, I think let's just distinguish, for simplicity's sake, let's distinguish two types of human being. There's a human being with a very rigid ego, and their mind is full of concepts. They have a clear idea of who they are. They have a strong sense of identity. Maybe this often applies to successful people, professional people. They have a strong sense of ego. They're full of their own self-importance and their own achievements, and which is, in some ways that can make life quite easy, but it also cuts you off from a lot. It cuts you off from your own deep being. um, it cuts you off from creativity. It cuts you off from spirituality because all of these things come from beyond the normal mind. Now, creativity doesn't come from inside us. It comes from somewhere else. It comes from a transcendent place. Um, you know, People with that kind of ego don't have psychic experiences either because they come from elsewhere. But there are degrees of separateness. There are degrees of ego boundaries. So let's take another person who has kind of soft ego boundaries. And it means that their ego is a bit like what could you compare it to? Well, it's not solid. It's kind of permeable. It's semi-solid, permeable. So a lot of stuff can come through from their own deep being. They can get a lot of maybe you know powerful states of being, powerful energies and potentials from within their own being. But also a lot of creative stuff comes through, a lot of ideas, a lot of inspirations come through. Um, and also, they're open to spiritual experiences because their ego boundaries are more soft. They feel more empathic, more compassionate towards other people. They feel more connected to the whole of nature, and it can make life a bit difficult. Some people with soft ego boundaries have psychic problems, psychological problems. They're a bit unstable, maybe suffer from depression, manic depression, bipolar, or whatever. Because in some ways, life becomes a bit more difficult with soft ego boundaries, but it becomes much more interesting, and it becomes an incredibly exciting adventure. As soon as your ego boundaries are closed and rigid, then life gets boring.
And so we have the current situation in the world of wealthy people accumulating more and more wealth that they don't need
Hmm.
to make their own ego feel bigger, more grandiose. And they're looking for something. They're greedy, as each of us are, for more, but the more they're greedy for is money and power. And what
Hmm.
we're greedy for is compassion, connectedness, more love, more feeling of communion with other people.
That's
And
right.
what I'm asking you, and I'm asking myself, and I ask a lot of people, what who are on a mission, because when you're on a mission, it really is fun. I mean, no matter what you say, yeah, I got to sit down and write this thing, and it's like I don't know, do I really want to do it? Yes, I do want to do it, and it gets to be a lot of
You
well,
have to do it.
you have to. The point is, you have to do it, Steve. You
That's right.
have to do it. My best friend from high school says, "Boy, you're doing a lot, Bernie." And my response is, "Hey, I can't help it. I've got to do this. If I don't do it, I don't feel right." And
Yeah. Mm.
it's just, and then when I'm doing it, as you have said, it makes you, makes you feel good. You enjoy doing it. Even
Yeah.
the required editing, it's part of it. And I like writing it first, like that, like a lot of people,
Yeah.
because you can
Yeah.
let it all flow through you. But then you got to use your regular ego to
Yeah.
recognize that there are other people who are going to read this, and you got to make sense to them, and it's
Yeah.
got to look like a sentence so that they can understand it. And,
That's
and
right.
so we got to do that. But even that, the pain of that, which isn't that much, is still part of the whole process, and you know
Mm.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a marvelous feeling. It's like a river when I'm sort of doing what I am supposed to be doing. I feel like I'm just swimming with a river with a fast current. The river's just carrying me. I'm not even swimming really. The river's just carrying me and I'm floating along. It feels kind of exhilarating. It feels right. Um, yeah, and it's about connection again. I feel like I'm connected to something bigger than me. I'm connected to a deeper, transcendent power.
Well, you are, and when you talk about rivers, I've heard that one before, because it's the Tao, and the
Mm.
Chinese Tao is a flowing thing.
Yeah.
It flows, and or as we used to say, go with the flow, or some form. It's still like that, but being in the flow increases
Mm.
synchronicities. That it just happens when you're there, and those synchronicities are like little signs along the banks of this river that
Yeah.
says, "Hey, this way," and you're really onto it. You
Yeah.
you want a carrot or something, or just keep going, because this is what you're doing. And you got to keep doing it, because it's too much fun floating on this river that you don't have to do much about except paddle your whatever. And this is
Mm.
where you get into row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is but a dream. That
Mm.
childhood thing is a good way of thinking about what you're doing, and what I'm doing is you stay with the river and keep
Yeah.
going with it, but you got to paddle,
Yeah.
you got to be
Yeah.
gentle, and
Mm.
you're doing that, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I like one of my favorite writers is D.H. Lawrence, the English author, and he's got a really beautiful poem called The Song of a Man Who Has Come Through. And it begins with him saying, not I, but the wind that flows through me. The wind that blows through me. And he was a good example of that. He felt that there was something there was a wind blowing through him, and his job was just to kind of guide the wind lightly and just to allow it to express itself.
That's what we're talking about. And part of
Yeah.
what, yeah, that's what we're
And,
talking
and
about,
and I
Steve.
think fundamentally what it is, it's an evolutionary impulse. It's an impulse that's guiding the human race to a new level of evolution, to a new kind of consciousness. And yeah, I think we're all part of that.
We we can be part of that. That's there is this chancy thing called free will, and
Mm.
it's free will is not the right word for it. We have a limited amount of choice. We can't make a lot of things happen, but we can within the frame of our river and our where what we have capacities to do. And what you're doing, it seems, Steve, is helping people recognize not only the variations in time that we can experience, but to recognize the various ways people become spiritually awakened. What do
Mm.
you mean by spiritual awakening?
I understand spiritual awakening outside the context of religion, even outside the context of spiritual traditions, although obviously it can occur within spiritual traditions, but fundamentally it's a human experience, it's a psychological experience, which can happen to anybody, even if they don't know anything about conventional spirituality, even if they consider themselves to be an atheist, it can still happen to them. And it's basically a shift in identity. It's the replacement of the normal identity, a person's normal identity, with a new spiritually awakened self. And there are lots of different characteristics of spiritual awakening or spiritual wakefulness. One of them is a heightened perception. People's perception becomes more intense, so they're more aware of beauty. The world seems more real and vivid to them. They're more curious and more fascinated by everyday events and everyday phenomena. They also feel a strong sense of empathy and compassion for others, which manifests itself in altruism. People who become spiritually awakened often say that there is a shift away from a mode of taking from the world toward a mode of giving to the world, or a shift from accumulation to contribution. People also have their minds tend to be quieter. I mean, it's kind of a normal human experience for us to have restless, chattering thoughts flowing through our mind all the time. Whenever our attention isn't occupied, it gets filled with these restless associational thoughts. But spiritually awakened people, they don't sort of their minds are not completely empty, but that kind of chatter seems to be slower and quieter, resulting in a sense of inner calmness and inner peace. And there are a few other characteristics like a sense of gratitude, not taking things for granted anymore, sense of gratitude for life itself and for all the things that constitute our lives. Um, Also, not depending so much on external things for well-being, not depending on possessions or achievements or beliefs or hopes. Spiritually awakened people tend to just have a natural well-being, which doesn't really come from anywhere. It's not caused by anything. It's just there as a natural condition of being. So as a result, they tend to live very simple lives without too many possessions or too much activity. Well, not really bothered about success or status, just being contented as they are.
Well, what concerns me about what you're describing is that it's a wonderful state people need to be in. And you just reminded me of some guy that's been very competitive with me, who said, "Boy, you've got more interviews with people on synchronicity than anybody in the world." And I have about 500 of them, and they're mostly about synchronicity. And and he's been like competitive with me for a while, and I hear him say that, and I'm saying, "Hmm, Yeah, it's like it's going to rain tomorrow is the way it felt to me. And it was a kind of a measure of what you're describing is how that kind of accolade does not necessarily um, do something to an ego that's kind of like diminishing, not getting deflated, but it's becoming a different form than I have experienced. So I was a little surprised by my own reaction to that.
Hmm, hmm.
And it seems to
Well,
me, go ahead.
well, I'm just saying. I mean, these are normal human reactions, and it takes a long time for them to die away. I mean, I think they diminish, but I think it's quite rare for them to die away. I mean, I think even after people undergo some degree of spiritual development or spiritual awakening, they sometimes carry over little traits from their previous self, and it can take time for them to go away. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it's probably there are probably very few people who are going to transcend all of these petty little emotions entirely. They're still going to rear up occasionally. Maybe it depends what kind of mood we're in. You know, I find that if I'm just too busy or a bit stressed or I haven't spent enough time alone or I haven't meditated for a while, that's when these kind of things may come up in my mind. But when they come up, I think, as long as you notice them and you think, that's not really an edifying emotion or that's not really a spiritual place to be. As long as you recognize them, you can just allow them to fade away, and then you can return to a state of relative well-being.
Yeah, yeah. To me it was after a while a little funny, which this whole life thing is pretty funny. Just being in it is there's a lot of humor that if you're in the right place you can notice it. But
Yeah, I think as long as you can sort of stand back and observe these things
that's the
with a sense
idea.
of detachment, then that's
Yeah,
fine. So it's when you get attached to them and they sort of grow and then they take you over. That's when they become really harmful.
that's well said. That's really true. That's really true. So we're coming to the end of our delightful conversation, Steve. And I I still wonder once a person becomes content through a spiritual awakening and satisfied with who they are and what they're doing, that I'm afraid some may lose the sense of mission that you have and that
Hmm.
I have to try to make something happen. Now, how do you
Uh,
put that together?
I don't think that's the case actually, because there is a common idea that spiritual awakening means becoming detached or indifferent to the world, you know. But in my experience, my personal experience, and also in my research, I have found that when people become spiritually awakened, they become more concerned for the world and more concerned for others. And they feel a stronger sense of that's when they feel a strong sense of mission because they're more they're more sensitive to the suffering in the world and to the problems in the world. So they actually become more engaged usually. And I often refer to the fact that a lot of the great social activists in human history were spiritually awakened people, like Gandhi. He was a really successful social activist. Martin Luther King, or my favorite example is Florence Nightingale, who was responsible for so many here in the UK and, you know, by extension to the rest of the world. She was responsible for so many reforms in health and hygiene and sanitation. She single-handedly created the profession of nursing in the 19th century. She was a spiritually awakened person. The ground motivation for all her actions was her openness um, to other people's suffering, and she felt from a young age that she had a mission to try to relieve suffering, and because she was basically a mystic, a spiritually awakened person. So I think maybe there are some cases where people become detached from the world. They live in monasteries or refuges or hermitages or whatever. But I think in most cases, people actually, because they become more open or more empathic and compassionate, they actually become more engaged and contribute more to the world.
Well, that's a wonderful answer, Steve. And I would add that at least for some of us who get into this mission thing, uh, it's also fun. I mean,
Yeah,
and it's educational. I mean, it's a can be a form of play where you do stuff and see what happens, and it's just
yeah.
fun playing around and seeing what happens when when you're trying to do something. I'm hoping to help gather people like you who want to be and think it's a good idea to be part of something that's a movement, and
Hmm.
however that works, that can feed off of each other as each of us has our own mission to do. Sometimes I think I'm crazy to want to do that because there's other people already doing that, but I have a particular way of thinking about it, and we don't have time to talk about it, but with all
Hmm.
the spiritual elevation I'm seeing many people do in spiritual groups, there's a lot of terrible interaction with each other. There's a
Hmm.
lot of people who project their own shadows onto other people, and that
Yeah.
creates a lot of turmoil. So I'm concerned that as we get spiritually elevated, we also have to get interpersonally more knowledgeable about
Mm.
how to manage our need for power and approval in groups. What do you think of that?
Mm. Yeah, that's an important issue. Spiritual communities can sometimes be quite toxic, and
Yeah.
some spiritual teachers can also be quite toxic individuals.
Indeed, and in the time we have left, how are you thinking about addressing that toxicity?
Well, I wrote an article a while ago called the Guru Syndrome. It tried to explain why so many gurus have kind of exploited and even abused their followers. You know, there are so many corrupt spiritual gurus out there. Sometimes it's more difficult to find an example of a good guru rather than a bad one. I mean, of course, there are many great spiritual teachers, but I think many people are attracted to gurus for the wrong reasons. They're not really attracted to them for spiritual awakening. It's kind of like a regressive need to hand over authority to a powerful figure, a powerful kind of quasi-parental figure. That's what you see in some spiritual communities. You see people who've abdicated responsibility for their lives and handed it over to this individual. And the individuals sometimes have narcissistic personalities and they become more narcissistic within their communities as they become more powerful. So it can be a toxic place. I concluded by my article by saying, if you're a spiritual seeker, it's best to stay away from gurus. And if you're a spiritual teacher, it's best to stay away from the guru role. Just spiritual awakening is part of everyday life. It doesn't need to take place in special communities or even with special individuals. You know, you can experience it while living a normal life. And you can find people who live a normal life, a relatively normal life, to guide you rather than these elevated individuals who take on the role of guru.
Oh, that's so good, Steve. That's so good. It reminds me of Sheldon Kopp's book called "If You Meet the Guru on the Road, Kill Him." Uh,
Right.
eh, and I just interviewed a guy from Berlin, and uh, and a Brit who moved over to Berlin, and our whole conversation started with his reaching for something on the shelf in his house, and he knocked off a Buddha statue, and the Buddha statue's head came off. It broke it, and this,
Right.
that's the metaphor that you are talking about here. And
Yeah. Yeah.
your description is beautiful, really. Of stay, give up the power to a narcissistic guy who's going to just exploit it more and make
Mm,
himself more important. That's such a beautiful um, statement.
mm, mm.
Can you send that to me? Send me a link to that
Yeah,
article.
yeah, yeah,
Just
yeah. It was based on my book, in my book Disconnected, which was published a couple of years ago. There was a chapter in that book about spiritual pathocracy or corrupt gurus. So yeah, I'll send you the link to the article.
wonderful, wonderful, because
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I'm trying to address. So we need to
Mm,
be able
mm.
to stop, Steve. Is there any last thing you'd like to tell our audience?
Um, Not really, but I mean, as we've been emphasizing, I guess the main thread of our conversation has been connection. And maybe I'd just like to remind people that even though sometimes we fall into separateness, we feel alone, we feel like we're enclosed within our own bodies and within our own minds. Usually that's when our lives become stressful and our minds become too busy, or maybe when stressful events occur or critical events occur in our lives. But beneath that, there's always this fundamental interconnection, which is, it's part of reality. It's our essence as human beings and as living beings. So it's always possible for us to reattune to that.
And you're helping us do that, Steve. And I thank you very, very much.
You too. You're welcome. Thanks a lot for the conversation.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.